and welcome back to Happy Porch Radio, Season 5, where we are looking at digital solutions in the circular economy. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Michael Groves, who is the CEO and founder of Topolytics, a leading data insights business that uses machine learning and geospatial analytics to make the world's waste visible, verifiable, and valuable. We had a very interesting conversation with Mike. We've actually spoken a lot about waste and data over the course of this season, and it was really interesting to get his perspectives. He has got big ambitions for mapping the world's waste, and he's really enthusiastic about taking on that challenge. I really feel that came across in this conversation, Barry.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also glad that I didn't have to say geospatial too much. I agree. We've talked about data and waste quite a lot, but I really enjoyed, I think this conversation was different in multiple ways. And apart from the, as you say, Mike's passion, and he talked a little bit about at the end of the interview about why that is or where that comes from and his desire to see or the importance of geography and geospatial data analytics in solving some of these tough problems. But all the way through, we're talking about, I guess, the importance of data, not just for its own sake, which is a theme that I've seen quite often, or feel like we've had throughout this season. It's more than just the tools.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's interesting to think about this solution in terms of the bigger picture of circular economy. As Mike himself mentions, waste is kind of a part of that, and the data is really important to gather so that we can design for a circular economy. But just how important all of this data and understanding it and the interpretation of it and cleaning it up and making it available to everyone, just how important that all is, I think is really represented in how successful Topolytics is becoming and everything that Mike is doing.
Absolutely. Especially for anybody listening who's interested in data or who works in data, I think there's a little taster here in what and how important your role is as a data person's role is in the circular economy and in meeting some of these tough challenges.
Definitely.
And so without any further ado, let's meet Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Groves. I'm the founder and chief exec of Topolytics, and we're a data aggregation and analytics business that's making the world's waste visible, verifiable, and valuable.
Awesome. I really like how really simple and clear that is, because waste is a big, complex, and very fascinating topic. So, Mike, welcome to Happy Porch Radio, and I'm really excited about this conversation. I think, as regular listeners will know, we've covered multiple different things, multiple different angles of the circular economy. And waste has been something that's come up a few times before, but I think it would still be interesting to kind of get your view on, I guess, waste in terms of the circular economy and how and why Topolytics is kind of working on that problem.
I don't know why you want to talk about waste, because it's such a rubbish subject. We'll maybe skip that and move on. So waste and circular economy, I mean, actually, they are sort of awkward bedfellows in some ways. I mean, we're, there's an organisation called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is the sort of global think tank, doing a lot of sort of really pioneering work around circular economy. And we're a member of that. We're a C100 company. And so one of the kind of questions, I get asked a lot is, but Mike, the circular economy isn't about waste. It's about, obviously designing waste out of the system. It's about, sort of making products and reducing use of those products or making them so that they can be, remanufactured or reused or kept in use, rather than those, materials and products going into the waste stream. But my answer to that, and the reason we focus on the waste bit, which is almost like the end of the pipe, is that, if you look at the numbers, they're huge. So if you look at World Bank numbers in terms of global volumes of what they call urban waste, which is like the kind of city type waste, going from 2 billion tons up to over about 3.5 billion tons over the next sort of 10 or 20 years. So we've got this massive, massive amount of material. So we've got this massive problem that we need to deal with. And still to this day, more than 60% of that material globally is still going into a landfill or is going into a waste dump, or obviously at worst is leaking into the environment. And hence we have people like David Attenborough highlighting the issue of ocean plastics, for example. So we still think the circular economy, yes, we need to sort of work to that ideal where we're sort of designing the wastage out of the system. But in the meantime, we've got to deal with that problem as we see it. So that's why we're trying to make that system of materials movements on a sort of global basis much more visible, so that you can build trust in the data. And ultimately, if there's trust in the data, then all the players in that system can then start to build better business cases to improve the outcomes for that material.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think you've said that in a much better way than I could have. Pulling out the word that you used there a couple of times, data. So you're approaching, there's a quote from somebody at Google who says that waste is a data problem, which I think is quite interesting. And I think that's, in my mind, that's exactly where Topolytics are. Is that fair?
Or data is a waste problem, yeah, because there's a lot of it out there and not a lot of it is being used effectively, I suppose. Yes, I mean, there's another quote actually, which I quite like, which was from the World Economic Forum years back. I think it was from Accenture. And it basically said that if the circular economy is going to be any kind of revolution, it will be a digital revolution. And I think by that, we clearly need digital tools to design better products and design better packaging and design waste out of the system. But by the same token, in terms of what we're doing, we think that there's an opportunity to drive digitization into the waste industry and the waste system, because it's a very traditional industry that has been sort of moving waste and disposing of waste for 150 years or so. And there is definitely, we see an opportunity to use data in a better way. I mean, clearly having data is one thing, but then as everybody says, it's what you can get out of the data. It's the insights that you can get from that data. So a lot of what we do is really just focusing on the quality of data, because there is a lot of rubbish data out there. We've said, look, there isn't a single source of the truth. I think this is true about most things in life. There's no single source of the truth. Everyone has a slightly different perspective. Everyone has a different take on a subject, and waste is no different. So there isn't a single perfect, beautiful digital footprint or data set for all of that material, whether it be plastics, paper, metals, chemicals, whatever it might be, food. So what our view is, in that scenario, what we've got to do is this is why we aggregate data. We've got to be able to pull data in from many different sources and many different forms. And then what we're good at doing is basically sort of breaking it down, cleaning it, normalizing it, so that you can then build it up again and actually start to make decisions based on what you're seeing. But what you've done is you've built a level of kind of quality and trust into the data. So we think actually, if we're going to get new business models, new ways of recovering material, new ways of recycling, new ways of reducing waste in the first place, I think digital technologies and tools are going to play a big part.
That's really interesting, Mike. I think, especially talking about that trust in the data, that's something that's come up quite a lot over the course of this season. And as you said, it's kind of impossible to design waste out of the system if we don't know everything there is to know about waste and where it's going currently. That's definitely the first, maybe also second, third, and fourth steps in this process. Is data is so vital. Can you tell us a bit more about the digital tools that you use at Topolytics?
Yeah, so we're pure sort of data, if you like, business. So what we're not doing is we're not, if you like, creating data from, for example, sensors. Sometimes people say to me, well, how do you put sensors onto all this waste and measure it? Well, we don't do that. But what we're really good at doing is extracting that kind of data and working with that kind of data, and then understanding the sort of fundamentals of that data and the structure and the quality and everything else that's attached to it. So there are sort of multiple ways in which some of this data within the waste sector is being acquired. So it could be acquired through apps, it could be acquired through sensors, it could be acquired through just honest to goodness sort of databases and software or whatever it might be. It could be acquired on a piece of paper and then put into a spreadsheet. So in terms of the sort of tools that we're using, it's all in the back end. It's all in the way you process that data, the way you ingest that data, the way you clean that data, the way you analyze that data. So we won a competition. So for example, we won a competition last year that Google Cloud and the big software company SAP ran, which was to find a commercial technology that enabled the circular economy at scale. And 250 companies applied globally, and we won that competition. So it was quite a privilege for us. But obviously, if you think about Google Cloud, I mean, it's one of the fastest growing bits of Google or of Alphabet. So it's a kind of cloud hosting, data processing bit of the bigger business. And so there's some really fantastic tools within that for machine learning, so for looking at patterns in the data, for cleaning and processing that data. So a lot of the tools we use are sort of really in the back end, in the guts of the system, where it's almost like the trenches. It's the really unglamorous bit, but it's the bit that's really, really, really important, because if we're going to present information to our customers and we're going to present it in a way that we can stand behind and we have confidence in, we can create a fantastic kind of view into that data through the dashboard or maps or whatever it might be. We really have to be sure that whatever data sits behind those kind of views into it is as good as it possibly can be. And we've also got to be very good at being able to pull that data into our platform we call Waste Map as easy as possible, because we're trying to do this at scale. We're sort of trying to, we're pulling data in significant quantities of data. So I think a lot of what we use is in that sort of the back end. And then we're using, obviously, various tools to visualize and to analyze and to kind of generate views into the data as well.
First of all, congratulations on winning that competition. It sounds fantastic. And I look forward to seeing how things pan out with it. Am I right in thinking that just so I've got a clear picture, data is out there and being collected by other people who are not you, and then Topolytics is gathering all of this data into one place? Is that right?
That's a pretty good summary. I mean, we're an aggregator, so we aggregate at scale because we think that, again, coming back to that sort of mission statement, if you like, about making the system more visible. It is a system, and we see it as a global system of interconnected materials movements, many thousands of different sort of companies and organizations involved in that system, many thousands of different materials and many millions of movements of that material. So that's the way we view it. So in order to make sense of that, we have to be able to work with many different types of data set from many different sources. So we're aggregating from those different sources.
Yeah. And then can you give us some examples of what your clients do with that data specifically?
Well, a big question for a lot of people is, and this is really something that's sort of really come to the fore over the last few years, I would say, is that fundamental question about what does happen to that material? Where does that material go? Because I think traditionally, because it's waste, it's kind of been out of sight, out of mind. And whilst certainly in Europe and the US and elsewhere, there is what you might call a duty of care, if you're a waste producer, to dispose of that material kind of correctly, there is still an element of opaqueness in the system, and not, those companies and organizations that are producing the waste, that somebody else deals with that material. They have a contract with somebody who takes that material away and they dispose of the problem. It's removed from their site. So that traditionally, I think that's been the sort of the way we've pretty well all viewed waste, is it not? Is that, we put it in a bin, somebody else removes the bin and does something with it. But I think that is definitely changing, and clearly, God bless David Attenborough, best environmental communicator bar none, and some of the work that he's done around, particularly around the ocean plastics and Blue Planet, etc., really, I think, opened people's eyes to, if you like, the stuff that's kind of leaking out of the system. And obviously plastics has had the most attention there. So I think that's a big question that we're helping people to answer. Now, you'd think it'd be easy to answer that question, but because of the nature of the system and the nature of waste and the way it's handled, that is quite difficult. So that's why, as a team, we have people that work on, so our team sort of really triangulates on three things: waste industry and circular economy. So we've got people that run waste management companies. We know the way the waste industry works. We've got software development team, and then we've got a data science team. So really, we're using data science to sort of try and answer some of these questions. So that's a kind of key question. We're currently also working with the UK environmental regulators, so DEFRA and the various national regulators, who have set a challenge to create what they call a smart waste tracking system for the UK. So this, in essence, is a digital system that can digitally track all waste movements across the UK. So we are building a sort of prototype version of that system at the moment. So the challenge, I think, for the regulator is much better oversight and much better visibility of the waste movements. And one of the kind of key things there is to try and address quite a big problem of waste crime. i.e., fly tipping material that's being disposed of incorrectly or improperly, a material that's being exported when it shouldn't be exported, or the wrong type of material that's being exported, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a huge problem with waste crime. So they're the kind of answers that, the kind of questions that the regulators have. And then I think if you think about the industry itself, the recycling industry, the waste management industry, there's a lot of new technologies that have been developed to recycle what were previously difficult materials to recycle. But what they need to understand is, where is that material? What does that look like? What does that sort of map of materials look like? So where could they best invest in capacity to effectively recover that material? So there's a whole range of different questions that we are answering for those different types of organizations.
There's something there which really appeals to the engineer in me, to the coder in me. All through that, you used the generic term waste. And yet in each of those scenarios, there's multiple, that covers. I noticed on your website, there's an example about gas, basically gas leaks. And then you're talking about plastics. And then you're talking about all the waste in the UK. And with that DEFRA example. So is that what, or how you're approaching that problem? You're looking at these, I guess, waste streams. Is part of that analysis of that data then maybe in certain cases breaking that down into different types, and how granular are you able to go in some of these scenarios?
So addressing that first point about that use case around sort of gas sensors. I mean, as Topolytics, we're focused on what you might call, kind of solid waste. So that will be your commercial, industrial waste streams, sort of household and domestic waste streams, and hazardous waste, which tends to be a solid or a sludge or a liquid. The gas sensing stuff was interesting because we knew that at some point there was going to be much more, if you like, this whole piece about industry 4.0, sort of Internet of Things, sensors, machine to machine, sort of data acquisition, etc. That was a sort of coming wave, or what is a coming wave, and that's going to hit the waste industry as much as it hits any other industry. But this was a few years ago, and we thought, well, actually, we need to understand how that kind of data works. We need to understand quality of the data. We understand how those sensors work, how that data is acquired, some of the sort of shortcomings, some of the opportunities. And actually, the idea of having sensors on bins is certainly that's a sort of growing area and growing fast. But at that point, we thought, well, actually, we can get sensors that are gas sensors. So we can at least understand how those kind of real-time kind of sensors work, and we can take that experience back into the waste sector. So that, I guess that's the first thing to say around that. You're right. I mean, this is one of the real, I get asked this question a lot. It's like, why don't you just look at a particular material? Why don't you just look at, a particular type of plastic or look at food? And we have deliberately set out to look at all of those types of material, because what happens is that material might be picked up in a mixed load. So it might be, plastics, card and paper mixed in the same container. It then gets taken somewhere where it's separated. But your card is mixed with card from other sources, and it then gets baled, it then gets sold and moved on. It's all a sort of interconnected system that's handled by, the same types of companies, passes through the same sites, but then it might get separated and move on to other sites. We think if we only look at one material, we'd only see one small part of that system. So we have to look at it on a sort of systemic basis. In terms of the granularity, so I'm a geographer, so I see the world through those eyes, if you like. In terms of what we're doing, if you think about the geospatial or the geographical piece of around waste, it's really crucial to understanding, number one, what happens to it, and number two, what could happen to it. So there's a piece around the relationship between where waste begins and where waste ends. So there's a sort of spatial relationship thing there. But also, if you think about geography and maps, there's a scale thing as well. So you could look at an atlas, and what you see is a sort of aggregated view of the United Kingdom on an atlas. So it doesn't give you all of the detail, but they just show you the main roads, they show you the main features. But what you can do, obviously, is you could zoom into a very detailed Ordnance Survey map that shows an individual building. So you've got a large scale view. So that's what we're trying to do with our platform, is to be able to zoom in right down to the level of an individual bin or an individual container, and you can have data attached to that, or you can zoom out and see thousands or millions of containers, and what you do is you aggregate the view or aggregate the data. So you aggregate and disaggregate as you go. But our starting point is to say, the more granular the data that we work with, the more accurate the, if you like, the atlas view will be, if that makes any kind of sense.
It does. It makes complete sense. It also, well, there's quite a lot there. It also gives a real insight into the complexity of the problem. Right? As you say, it's really hardcore data science. Never mind the gathering and validating of that data. Something you said earlier about there being no single source. It was almost very relieved to hear somebody say that, because I feel often in the digital space we're too structured, we're too linear, we're kind of different, we're sort of separate from the real world. So we're trying to force binary logic onto what is not a binary system at all. And so it's really interesting when you said that, and then about sourcing data from multiple places and then trying to aggregate it and understand it in a way that's very real world. I think that's what I heard from what you were describing there.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. Yeah, I mean, the phrase I always use is there's no single source of the truth. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And the other phrase that's a favorite of my chief technology officer is even messy data is useful data. So, of course, we see a lot of data that, we see some very good data, and then we see less good data, but actually even the less good data can be useful to us. Real life is messy, is it not? Whatever you're looking at, whatever aspect of real life. And waste is no different. You've got multiple organizations, you've got multiple materials, you've got different ways of describing that material, you've got different ways of classifying that material, you've got different ways of measuring that material. People take slightly different approaches, even though there are, where there are regulations in place and there might be sort of schemes in place. But yeah, so you've got these multiple players who are all describing and measuring in slightly different ways, and waste might be taken to a weighbridge, but how do you know the weighbridge has been calibrated properly? There's all sorts of subtle and not so subtle variations in the system, and these are the kind of things that we're trying to pick up and analyze, and so that we can build up this, try and build to a better version of the truth. Even if it isn't a perfect view, it's still better than having no real idea at all about what's going on.
Yeah, that's a lot of variation in the data. I can imagine that that's the magic, when you can pull it together and make it in some way uniform and usable. And I imagine that's especially difficult in terms of working around the world and in different regions and across different continents. What happens on the other side when, instead of too much messy data, there's actually a hole in the data and it's kind of not even out there to be found?
Yeah, I mean, even in what you might call data-rich environments, there's always holes. So that's the first thing to say. I mean, I think part of the messiness might be lots of holes. So we're used to that. But as you say, in certain different countries, you've got different regulations, you've got different levels of sophistication around how information's being captured, if any information's being captured at all. Yeah, so that's where we're sort of like, we'll try and sort of bring in data that maybe comes from, large companies that might have a footprint in that country. So it gives us something that we can work with. So again, our approach to this is almost like a crime scene procedural, where you start with a sort of known connections. You just gradually build up a picture, or you sort of model it as you go. And that's basically our approach, where we normally have something, but it might be very limited, and we just sort of build from there. It's a challenge, but to be perfectly honest, that's the challenge we set ourselves, because we think actually that's where there is an opportunity. But I do get, lots of people say to me, Mike, it's just why are you doing this? It's just so difficult, and also I do get, various trips to Silicon Valley, and I sort of stood up and I pitched, and I'm like, we're building this meta map of the world's waste, et cetera, et cetera. And in Silicon Valley, you get, oh, Mike, that's awesome, and you get that reaction. But I do also get the reaction, but Mike, you'll never do that. And so my view is, well, building up that perfect 100% view of all of that, material, yes, it's very challenging, but we're giving it our best shot. But also, the more we see, the more we can model, and we can improve the modeling. So even where we do have limited data, we can still infer things and we can still draw conclusions. But you're right, it is a real challenge. But fundamentally, our approach is to say, whatever we do in, say, the UK or the US or whatever it might be, we've got to say this has to work across all countries. It's a constant sort of challenge, that one, but something that, we're well used to, and, a challenge that we happily accept.
why do you do it?
Yeah, there you go. The $64 million question, yeah.
In the face of all that challenge, as you described, and also in the face of that, not necessarily pushback from people saying it can't be done or you won't do it, but just kind of that reality that it is a really huge undertaking. What is it that kind of keeps you going on a day-to-day basis?
I love the challenge. I guess that's the first thing. And I love it when people tell me I can't do something. That's the red rag to a bull, isn't it? There's a whole range of things going on. I mean, there's the entrepreneur thing. I mean, I guess, I'm an entrepreneur. And what do entrepreneurs do? They love, I guess to a certain extent, they have an appetite for risk. They love a challenge. They love creating value from where there was no value, where there was nothing, So I love that aspect of it. I'm trying to build, this isn't my first company, a number of startups and sold one company and et cetera, but I'm really trying to build something that's scalable and significant. That's something I'm trying to do as well. By the same token, why waste? I mean, I sometimes tell a story. I was involved in the very early days of the Forest Stewardship Council. So this is like very early days in the late 90s where we were trying to certify sustainable forest management. So we were trying to sort of, the Forest Stewardship Council was one of the first sort of independent certification schemes for sustainable forest management. And so I worked for a company that was one of the auditors against that kind of standard. So I basically ran around Southeast Asia. I was based in Jakarta and ran around Southeast Asia, going into all of these remote forests in Borneo and Malaysia and Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, etc., and trying to check that the forests were being managed against these kind of standards. And I spent a lot of time, in the forests and at logging camps and, bumping around in ancient Toyota Land Cruisers. But occasionally, of course, one would have a day off and occasionally one would go to the beach, being in Southeast Asia. And of course, many a time, I'd come across a tide line full of, flip-flops or plastic bottles. And this was the best part of 25 years ago. And I thought to myself then, how on earth did that material end up in this remote sort of pristine kind of location? And so I guess there's an element that if you think about the why, that was that first point where I thought, this is really strange. This shouldn't be happening. And then, so I've always worked in and around environmental management, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So to a certain extent, that bit in terms of actually trying to do something that has an environmental benefit whilst also makes money, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, is something that motivates me.
Thanks for sharing that story. That's cool. And I'm very glad that the world has people like you with an entrepreneurial spirit to take on these challenges, because I imagine it is not easy on day in, day out.
Yeah, it has its moments, let's put it that way.
We started this conversation talking about circular economy and the idea of designing waste out of the system. And you've talked about kind of big plans for mapping the whole world and waste. But what, in terms of the big picture, what do you see as the future of waste?
Initially, at least, I think what we need to be doing is reducing the volume of material that enters the system. Waste material is clearly the big aim. But where that material is being disposed of in some way or put into a bin, or whether it be production waste from a factory or whether it be from a retail operation or whether it be, our own bins at home, making sure that that material isn't just kind of disappearing into a hole in the ground or disappearing into rivers, I think is the initial clear and present danger that we have to try and address. So that's the first thing. But then in parallel with that, it is, I think, about clearly looking at substitute materials, looking at reducing the amount of raw material that we use in products and or packaging, moving to that position where, in essence, we're trying to design both products and associated packaging, but also the commercial systems whereby that product is kept in use, or is the utility of that product is maximized. And that's clearly what the circular economy. Clearly, there's a piece there about materials, but there's a whole piece around, if you like, the financial and the business models attached to how we access those products. Do we just rent or lease something as opposed to buy something? Those kind of like the servitization type models. So there's a whole piece of work around that as well. But purely in terms of the sort of materials piece, clearly it is about ultimately reducing that which goes into the waste stream, but that which does go into the waste stream, making sure that it isn't just being lost, and we are at least trying to capture, to its highest possible degree, the value in that material. Now, it may be that some of that material does end up being converted into energy, but obviously what we're trying to do is actually recover as much of it and reuse as much of it, or recycle as much of it as we can.
What's your next, Topolytics, what's the vision aligned to that, as you just described? Are you able to sort of share the impact you would like to have? You said you were looking to build a scalable, impactful business.
Well, I guess if you're looking for a parallel, somebody, so these aren't my words, somebody likened us to the Bloomberg for waste in that way. That's the sort of ambition, is that we become this global, trusted source of insights from which people are then able to make these better commercial and environmental, or get these better commercial and environmental outcomes. But, some of the work that we're doing with, for example, having won that competition with SAP, for example, if you look at SAP, they have set very, very ambitious goals around addressing some of these big problems. For example, the ocean plastics problem, carbon emissions. And as a big enterprise software company, what they see a lot of data on in terms of raw materials. They see a lot of data on production, see a lot of supply chain data, and they work with some of the world's biggest consumer product companies, for example. So where they have these ambitions around driving waste reduction, driving circular economy goals, we can directly feed into that through some of those relationships. So in terms of what we're doing, linking the insights that we're able to provide about what happens to that material once it goes into that, if you like, that waste system, linking that back into the, if you like, purchasing and supply chain systems, because it is a supply chain issue, is really interesting to us. So that starts to really try and close the loop. That's where you're really closing the loop in terms of the circular economy and materials. So we're doing some really, really interesting work in that regard as well. So, but I think fundamentally, we, this idea of us as this, a sort of global kind of trusted kind of insights that people can access on a sort of live basis is the ambition. Yeah.
That's really interesting and inspiring. The example, it took me a moment, I guess, to connect the Bloomberg example, but then that does make complete sense to what you're just like the real time and deep market insights that somebody like that provides. You're looking at that in the real world waste and the people who need to make business and supply chain and circular decisions there. That's really, really interesting. And as you say, has the potential to really scale and have that huge impact. And I'd love to go into all of that in more detail, but as we're running out of time, I'd like to finish on a slightly different question. For those listening, particularly those who maybe are interested in things like data science or this sort of geography, geospatial, or the machine learning, the kind of the tools that you're using to reach that big vision you just laid out. For those people listening who might be interested in working out how they can get involved, perhaps in contributing to that kind of vision or to the problems that they care about, and this is maybe a tough question, but what advice would you give them?
I did a TEDx a few years ago called Why Geography is Going to Save the World, or Saving the World with Geography, I think it's called. So I'm passionate about geography and geospatial science and how it can absolutely play a leading role in actually trying to achieve some of these ambitious goals that we have, or these challenges that we have globally, not least of which, of course, is climate change. So I would say to anybody who's thinking about, where they might go, both the geospatial science bit and then pure data science and data analytics. I mean, you can't get a data science or a data analyst for love nor money at the moment because there's such demand. So I would say that anybody who's looking at that, I think there's lots of opportunity out there. Professionally, I think there is a sort of growing demand. Clearly, build back better, post-COVID and all the stuff there about how we deal with the current sort of situation that we're in, but how we then build from that and build in a better way. And I think there's all sorts of opportunities there. There's a lot of kind of really good stuff out there in terms of courses and short courses and online courses. There's, you've got people like the Digital Catapult, you've got the Future Cities Catapult. So some of these places where you can make connections and network and learn. And then in Scotland, you've got a thing called Code Clan, where they basically run 16-week data science courses for people that are coming from completely different backgrounds. And we've actually recruited somebody from that course. So there's then you've got innovation centers like the Data Lab. So I think there's quite a lot of that kind of stuff out there. And I think there's a growing amount of help out there for people that want to sort of maybe look at some of these tools and techniques and learn more about it and maybe move into that area. And certainly when it comes to demand from the point of view of your kind of jobs and the market, I can only just see that growing, really. So I occasionally have been into schools and just talked about geography and mapping and how important it is, but also how there's an opportunity there. I mean, when I was at school, geography was kind of like, yeah, right, you've got your pencils and your tracing paper because all you do is you trace maps, don't you? But I think clearly it's moved on enormously. And now we've got all these, obviously Google Maps and all the mapping platforms. You've got, the whole piece around satellite data and the plethora of satellite platforms that are generating significant amounts of data. So somebody needs to sort of analyze that and process that and interpret it as well and generate the kind of insights from that. So I think there's all sorts of really, really interesting opportunities out there for people and it's never too late. I'm in my mid-50s, I'm an old guy, and I'm still trying to do something, so I think that's my other thing. It's never too late.
I think that is the inspiration there, as you said, the thing that you're passionate about, and tying back to what you said before about not shying away, in fact, enjoying the tough challenges, because that is where the excitement is, that is where the impact is, that is where the opportunity is, both business opportunity and as an individual. So that's really inspiring, and huge thank you for sharing a little insight into your story, and we'll put links to all the things you mentioned there in the show notes on Happy Porch Radio, as usual. And just very finally then, Mike, so anybody who wants to find out more about the work that you're doing and about Topolytics, where should they go?
Well, you'll find topolytics.com. You'll find some information there, but I'm Michael Anthony Groves on LinkedIn, so always happy to sort of connect to people. And I'm always really happy to just talk about this stuff. So if anybody wants to reach out, I'm really happy just to have conversations, make connections, whatever it might be.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful and inspiring to have you on the show. Thanks again, Mike.
No problem. Great to talk to you both. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
You can find notes and links from this episode, plus a full transcript at happyporchradio.com. If you are enjoying the show, please take a moment to give us a positive review on your favourite podcast app. Thanks for listening to Happy Porch Radio.